Welcome back. Time for our FCS weekly discussion. I'm joined by Jay and Tom in studio right now. We'll bring in Bishan and Alex in a bit, but I want to start with the rankings. So let's bring up those graphics really quick. First of all, the STATS FCS Poll as of this week. North Dakota State number 1, South Dakota State moving up to that second spot. James Madison lost. They dropped down to number 6. And then 24, South Dakota is back in the poll. As for other Valley teams, Illinois State coming in at number 12. Now for the coaches poll, looks a little bit different. North Dakota State still in number 1. South Dakota State all the way down at number 5. And James Madison, after losing to Elon at home, they are number 8. South Dakota receiving votes in this one. Illinois State still at number 12. So now bringing Jay and Tom in. You guys, both your teams moved up. Fortunately, South Dakota State going up to number 2 in that STATS FCS poll. Jay, USD is back in the top 25. But Tom, we'll start with you. Is that the right spot?
For the South Dakota State?
For South Dakota State, yeah.
I think they're okay with being number 2, obviously, in the stats poll, and 5 in the coaches poll. That's fine. I don't know if the coaches pay attention to that stuff or if they even vote in it. But you look at the other teams in there, North Dakota State is the obvious number 1. And then after that, Kennesaw State plays in a bad conference. Didn't have a great win last week. Eastern Washington is in there, but they just beat a team that's 0-5. If Eastern Washington beats Weber State coming up in their next game, then I think they're probably for real. But yeah, South Dakota State's really happy right now just to still be in the top 5 after an underwhelming performance against Indiana State.
Yeah, good spot to be at. Jay, meanwhile, for USD, they move into the top 25 now at 24. So touch on that, but then also James Madison dropping all the way down to number 8 in the coaches. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, in terms of the Coyotes, I think they've gotten what they've earned to this point. Second time into the top 25 this year, and then, of course, the last time they were in, they lost to Weber State in a rough outing out in Utah. So, you know, considering who they've beaten, I've got no problem with them being in there at number 24. As far as James Madison, that's laughable that team would fall all the way down to the 8th spot, even with a loss at home to that Elon team last week. I think that's a really pretty good indication of just how much value we should put in that particular poll.
In that particular poll. So with that, what poll do we pay attention to? Only Stats FCS?
Can we say just pay attention to the playoffs? Because really that's all that matters. No, I think, yeah, Stats FCS I think is the most accurate or the most true indication of where teams really are. None of them are perfect. We all know that. But I think there's too many out there for one thing. And ones like that coaches poll, it's pretty obvious that people who really do pay attention to teams other than the one that they work for or are affiliated with, you know, those are the people that are voting in the stats poll. This coaches poll is kind of a joke.
Agreed. All right. Well, let's head up to North Dakota now with Alex in our Grand Forks studios. It is snowing in Grand Forks, by the way. And Brian in West Fargo. Guys, rankings-wise, your teams didn't move. So let's move to this weekend. We'll get to Tom and Jay's take on this, too, in a little bit. But out of our 4 schools, I want to hear the argument for who has the biggest game come Saturday. So, Alex, we're going to start with you. Fresh off a bye week. Right back in the fire with the Grizz coming to town. And with 6 games left, not a whole lot of room for error when thinking about the playoffs. Is this the biggest game of the weekend for our Dakota FCS schools?
Oh, I think it's certainly a marquee matchup, Kelly. I mean, people tend to forget North Dakota and Montana share a border, and there's definitely a regional rivalry between the two, albeit a one-sided one in recent years. In their last 2 meetings, the Grizz really hammered a pair of injury-plagued North Dakota teams in Missoula. So there's a little extra motivation on the Fighting Hawks side to get a win here now that they're back at home. And then there's the national implications with this. Both of these teams are projected to make the playoffs right now, so this becomes a great testing ground for both. A win, and UND is right back in the, we assume the top 25 and in pretty good shape. A loss, though, and they're pretty much going to have to win out to make the playoff field of 24. So it is a big, big game. Whether or not it's the best in the Dakotas, I'll leave that up to the rest of the crew to decide.
All right, still a big game. Bishan, as for the Bison, I don't think it can be argued that of the 4, their game at Western is the biggest. But even though NDSU is 5-0 all-time in Macomb, 3 of those wins have been one-possession games. So why do they struggle there?
Well, I think Macomb is one of those places, it's the toughest travel trip of any place in the Missouri Valley because you have to fly somewhere, then you have to bus a couple of hours. Then Western Illinois makes it a night game, so now you're sitting around all day before you're playing. You don't know what the elements are going to be. And North Dakota State just doesn't play outside very much. And that's all I think factors into this. But the biggest thing I think for Western Illinois is they get up for this game, they know NDSU's scheme really, really well, and they play really, really well at home. When you look at Western's season, their schedule, they've lost 3 games, all away games. The 2 games they've had at home, they've beaten Montana, which is a really, really quality win. And then they've also beaten Youngstown State at home in kind of a shootout. So I just think it's one of those places that you have to create your own energy. Not a lot of fans there. It's going to, like I said, the night game. You can factor all that in. I think that's a big reason why going to Western is tough. And then take out of the equation too, Kelly, that it's back-to-back road games for North Dakota State. Anytime you go back-to-back on the road in the Valley, that second game is always really difficult.
Facts. And Macomb, yeah, it's not the most exciting city to play in. Anyways, back down to Sioux Falls. Jay, I want to hear from you first on this one, because you do think of the 4 FCS schools, USD's game with Northern Iowa this Saturday is the biggest game.
I do think so, and it's got a lot to do with UNI as much as it does with USD, because the Panthers already have a couple of FCS losses on their resume. They lost to Montana, and they also lost now to North Dakota State. So losing again now and in conference to South Dakota would really be troublesome for their playoff hopes. On the other side for South Dakota, we know that they're going to have to play well down the stretch to make the playoffs. We talked a few weeks back about what we needed to see from them to get them back into that conversation. I think 6 wins would definitely do it. 5, has a pretty good chance of doing it. And so winning your games at home is the most important part of that whole equation. And of course, in a couple of weeks, you got North Dakota State coming to town. Can't afford to have a slip up here against the Panthers. It's a virtual must win for USD, I think.
I think so too. All right, last but not least, we can't sleep on SDSU. Tom, the Jacks have Youngstown at home. Youngstown isn't ranked. They're not receiving votes. They're 2-3, blah, blah, blah. But a team that earned the Jacks' attention heavily after what happened last year in Youngstown. The Penguins are definitely better than their record.
They're 2-3. You are what you are, I guess. That was the late Danny Green, or somebody said something close to that. But Youngstown State comes in with a transfer quarterback. This is what South Dakota State faced last week at Indiana State with Ryan Boyle, who was a transfer from the University of Iowa, really getting the reins on that program in Indiana State. Same thing this week against Youngstown. They have a quarterback named Montgomery Van Gorder. He's from Georgia, and he's got a great name, but he is a transfer from Notre Dame. He was there for 3 years, didn't play, but he's kind of getting the handle on the offense at Youngstown State, so the Jacks have to deal with that. And just the impact of all these transfer quarterbacks coming in goes back to Chris Strevler last year at USD. These guys can make a big difference, so that's what South Dakota State has to face this weekend. The Jacks are going to be favored by a couple of touchdowns, but we know how that went last week, so SDSU just got to take care of business against Youngstown.
All right, thank you so much, guys. Great stuff. By the way, that South Dakota State game against Youngstown live on our network kicks off at 2 p.m. and then USD playing their first night game since 2009. That kicks off on Midco SN2 at 6 p.m. on Saturday. So a busy day of sports on our network.